and thank you all for coming out on this very chilly, cold night. I guess I'm going to answer this question, what is permaculture, but maybe a little bit through just giving you all my background to help contextualize this all. I actually got into permaculture in a really roundabout way before knowing what it was called by studying cultural anthropology at college. And I just got really fascinated by how the way human society looks has been shaped by how we get our food and how we interact with our environment. And I felt like there were a lot of problems that I began to see in the human kind of trajectory that we were on, and really was trying to dive into, okay, what do we do about it? And I didn't know leaving college, but I felt like somehow it had to do with our food systems. So I started farming. It's amazing to me still looking back that I farmed in a for-profit organic farming career for about 5 years after college. And not once did it actually occur to me to ask, what is the ecology around me? How does that influence how I'm growing? The farm that we worked on grew organic vegetables, and it looked pretty much the same as an organic vegetable farm in any state in the US, with slight adjustments of irrigation scheme, but it had nothing to do with our ecology. And that actually started bothering me a little bit, even though I couldn't quite put a finger on it. And that was round about the time that I first heard the word permaculture. And I think so often permaculture is associated with food production because that's a big part of sustaining us. But what it really asks is, how can we deeply observe the ecosystems around us and use the patterns of healthy wild ecosystems to design human systems? And I won't harp on the history of permaculture long, but I think it's really interesting to note that Bill Mollison, who is an Australian guy, coined this term in the 1970s. And the reason he came up with it as a concept is he was one day sitting and observing the landscape and watching marsupials and thinking, wow, these animals are so well adapted to their environment. Why aren't humans like that? And then he thought, actually, wait, humans are like that. There's indigenous people all around me, the Aboriginal societies that work just like that. And so in a way, what he said is, most humans for all of history have lived this way in relationship to ecosystems, and some of us have recently forgotten. And to me, permaculture is the toolkit for how do we rediscover how to live with those patterns. And I'm not going to get into this deeply, but did just want to flash up this slide briefly that kind of explains these ethics that permaculture is grounded in, which are care for earth, care for people, and understanding in a way that we can't actually care for either without caring for both. And then the fair share, which speaks to the redistribution of abundance instead of the accumulation of abundance. And then there's all these principles that are basically like the rules nature follows. And that if we're designing a system, if we can follow them too, they give us really helpful guidelines. And so just wanted to contextualize that a little bit. And also share that you'll probably hear a whole lot of different definitions of permaculture. It's a pretty, yeah, I think it's still one of those concepts that we're creating on the ground by practicing it. But the one that I like most is a design science that uses nature as a model for designing human systems, whether that's food, whether that's buildings, whether that's pollinator gardens that are there for aesthetics and for how we kind of get to see and participate in the ecosystems around us. The one framework that I think is really helpful when we start thinking about water harvesting that I did want to introduce is ecological succession. I'm sure that I learned about this in high school and promptly forgot about it until I came back to permaculture. Maybe many of you are the same. But on the left here, this progression that ecosystems follow. And it's a little oversimplified. You should really start with the lichens, but for our purposes, we're going to say that the beginning of this progression is disturbance. A flood, a fire, a bulldozer, a pig rooting through a forest with his snout. And I think what you see after that is that there's a particular type of plant that's really good at filling that niche, plants we often call weeds. Wendell Berry, who's a farmer writer that I love, calls them the band-aid of the earth. They're really good at covering it up fast. In a natural ecosystem, those plants slowly die back, and the next generation of plants emerges, which is perennial grasses. And it even calls them perennial weeds here, but we'll call them forbs for a term that I like a little bit better. Flowering plants that you would see in a healthy prairie. And then you evolve to shrubs. And then you end up with the kind of softwood forests, and then these old growth hardwood forests. And at any point in this progression, you can stop when you run out of water. When you don't have consistent water, you can't get any further, which is why all around us, we're stuck in this grassland phase. But what's so helpful to think about as a permaculture designer and any designer is that every one of these climax ecosystems gives us really useful patterns for understanding how to design our landscapes. So if we're in a setting where we get 16 or 20 inches of rain a year, like we get here, we can say, what are the patterns of a perennial healthy grassland and how can we copy that in our landscaping? Or if we have a little bit more water, how does a riparian forest look in Colorado? How can we copy the architecture and the patterning and the soil prep of that in our landscapes? And so we'll touch on this a little bit more in a moment, but I just wanted to give that framework that so often it's helpful to decide, where am I trying to actually garden in this progression? And for us, most of our food systems actually sit over here on this annual weed side, but many of the landscapes we have in our backyards sit higher up. And so it's a really helpful progression on a pattern level. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on as a framework is what they call the scale of permanence. Basically, the idea here is that the higher you are on this list, the harder you are to change. So climate, maybe collectively as humans, we are succeeding in changing it, but if you're working in your backyard, it's kind of the parameter you're stuck in. You personally can't change your climate a lot, so you're just working within that. The next hardest thing is to change is land form, and then water, and then all the way down this list. But where this is really helpful is what we understand is if we make a change high up on our landscape. If, for example, imagine a big hillside here with a very clear water pattern in it. If we go and we actually dig the earth so the water flows a different direction, that has shifted every single layer below it on the landscape. The vegetation changes, the microclimate changes, the soil fertility changes because we shifted the water pattern a little bit. And so this whole presentation is really grounded in how do we shift water patterns in our suburban landscapes and the tremendous ripple effect that that can actually have. For the record, this is also a really helpful framework as a decision-making order. If you are designing a landscape, you really don't want to decide, I want a tree here, how am I going to water it? That sometimes causes you to put in a whole lot of extra work. A much more practical way to think about it is, where is it easy to get water to on my landscape? That's where I'm going to put the tree. So there's a lot more to these, but I think they're two really helpful frameworks for just understanding how we look at and understand design. And this ties into the really cool opportunity that we have with water. Like I said, depending on where in Boulder County you are, but let's say Plains for the moment, we get probably between about 16 and 20 inches of rainfall in a year, mostly in winter and spring. That is not enough to take us beyond a grassland. And as a real grass nerd and grassland lover, I totally love grasslands, and there's tremendous value in copying the patterns of grasslands. But I wanted to show this overhead image of a random neighborhood in Boulder from Google Earth, because what it shows you is that, say we get 16 inches of rainfall here a year, there, to my kind of naked eye, no math here, but it looks to me like about 50% of all of the land here is actually covered by a roof or a street or a driveway. If we took all the water that fell on those landscapes and pushed it into the land, we just doubled our rainfall on that land. We just pushed us up to a 32-inch rainfall per year. And that means that with just the water that's actually being caught on our landscape, if we store it well, we can grow a forest. We can push ourselves along succession to have new types of diversity that we otherwise wouldn't, and that for many of us give us really great benefits like shade. And some of them may be more traditional aesthetic gardens that we like, and food crops that are a little hard to grow in a grassland. So when I see the value of actually catching rainwater and channeling into the landscape, it's that. It gives us the chance to push succession further. And in this suburban habitat that has already kind of messed with prairie ecology, we get a chance to create something new that might support even more biodiversity and potentially food, if that's your interest, than before. I bet you are all in this webinar because you already think water harvesting is important, so I won't harp on this. But as water becomes more scarce, being able to actually irrigate your landscape with water that you collect for free is truly a money saver. As we talked about, if we can create more forest type ecosystems, more diverse planting patterns, we can support biodiversity, kind of like a riparian area does otherwise. The connection between flooding and water harvesting is also so deep. And maybe just to touch on that briefly to contextualize it for those who might not have thought about it, when we get a huge rainstorm, right now, most of our urban areas are designed to take all that rain and get it off the landscape as fast as possible. All these kind of culverts and angled roads and everything that literally push that down into our river systems, into our waterways. That huge volume of water, when we have an enormous rainstorm, then turns into a flood. Nature almost never does that with water. Instead of centralizing it and concentrating it, nature has so many mechanisms to actually help it infiltrate and spread and sink into landscapes. And so when we do that in suburbia, when we put all that excess water that could turn into a flood into our landscape, we stop that problem. And you see that on a much bigger scale, of course, when there's a fire and flood cycle in the mountains. And then the final piece is just knowing that one, obviously we're creating landscapes a little bit less reliant on city water, and that's a resilience in and of itself. But we can also truly see that when we have wetter, moister landscapes over a big enough area, they actually draw water down. They create this cool, moist, wet microclimate that can truly shift the water patterns in an area. And if enough of us do that, we can accomplish that. So just wanted to contextualize that lightly. So the first step as a homeowner you're probably going to want to figure out is how much runoff water do you actually have? This math might feel daunting to some people, but it's incredibly simple. And so just for an example, I pulled up this kind of roof shot. So there's a really amazing free, I don't know what you call it, website, I suppose, Google Earth Pro. Literally, if you just Google that, you can get right onto it. On that Google imagery, you can actually measure distances. So you could totally go out with your measuring tape if you want. If you have a particularly large area or you just feel more comfortable in your house when it's -3 degrees outside, you can surely use this tool to just measure the distance of your roof. And so I did that here. You can see this is the line that the program spat out. I measured from here to here and got 50 feet. I see that over in this little box. This rooftop, 28 feet down. So I realize there's multiple roofs and surfaces here, but just for simplicity, let's say we want to know how much water falls on this entire roof. We're going to go ahead and multiply those 2 feet. And then we're going to say in a 1-inch rainstorm, 0.083 is 1/12. So in a 1-inch rainstorm, 116 cubic feet-ish of water fall on this roof. And the reason that we usually say a 1-inch rainstorm is around here, that's about the largest rainstorm we typically get. A little bit later, we'll talk about how to design for those like really extenuating circumstances of enormous rain, but we kind of want to design around the max that we usually get. That's the catchment size we're looking at. And so this is basically giving us the cubic feet of rain that fall on this roof in a 1-inch rainstorm. And a question that sometimes comes up is how do you account for the slope of the roof? Doesn't matter at all. From a raindrops perspective, this is a flat surface. So you just need to know the perimeter here. You can then go ahead and convert that cubic feet to gallons with this 7.48 conversion factor. So we now see that 873 gallons of water fall on this roof. This is a pretty small house by Boulder standards, so you can kind of get the feel for how much water that actually is. Then what may be helpful to know is how much flows to each gutter. And of course, this is a relatively simple roof. You might need to do a little extra math if your house is complicated. But basically what we can see on this roof is if we have a downspout on every side here, it's going to divide the rainfall on the whole roof into quarters. So we basically just divide that, 29.2 cubic feet per downspout, 218 gallons per downspout. In most landscapes, your roof is definitely not your only catchment. Some other catchments that are worth thinking about are your driveway. Often driveways are sloped to push the water down and onto the road and into the street. However, many of them also do have a slope back into the landscape. And even if you're not catching rainwater there, something to think about in winter is you're shoveling snow there. And so you're catching that water too. If you always shovel your snow both directions on your driveway, that's a chance to actually catch and harvest that water as well. You also may have terrain that's really rocky or sloped running into your property. The street itself can be an interesting source of water. We'll talk about that a little later, although I don't think there's a lot of curb cutting going on in Boulder yet. But just looking at the hardscapes, your patio, right? Your kids' play area, thinking about where water might come from, you can actually end up with significantly more runoff than just this. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to focus on roofs in particular, just because they're an easy starting point for people. Once you know how much area you have, you can start thinking about what type of catchment to use. There are a lot of different earthwork patterns that work really well for catching water. Just for the ease, I'm going to stick with these three. Partly because I have more experience putting them in, and they're just really kind of easy to wrap your head around ways to do this. The first thing I think people think about a lot is rain barrels. In Boulder County, it is legal to catch and store 100 gallons of water at any one time. So that's kind of like the quintessential rain barrel size that you see down in this left picture. That's a 50-gallon drum. So you can have 2 of those. What's kind of tricky with that is that that is about how much falls on a 10 by 15 foot structure. That's a kind of a storage shed size. So basically, if all you're looking to catch is what comes off your storage shed, amazing. This can be a useful storage container, but in most people's houses, the amount of rain you get in even a conservative rainstorm will immediately flood these holding tanks. And so before maybe talking about alternatives to that, I did want to show a picture on the upper right of a really solid system for this that is actually not permitted for most folks, but just to give you an idea, this size of IBC totes would catch about 600 gallons of water. That's a good amount from a roof. It's set up so that the water, this is a friend of mine's setup, but the water comes down and basically it's going to first fill up the upper tank. And that's helpful because that is the tank that actually has the gravity feed. So if you're trying to use the water, you get a little bit more pressure to run into an irrigation or even a hose. Once the top one fills up, the bottom one fills up. Once the bottom one fills up, there's an overflow that runs out into a mushroom log area. At any time, you could also use the water in these tanks to water those mushroom logs, which like the water. So that kind of volume is helpful. And you'll also notice that these are screened so that they don't get so much algae. Painting them black or putting a cover around them so sunlight doesn't get in there is helpful. But in most of our circumstances, we're going to be sticking with these 50-gallon drums. And I personally am not a huge fan of these as a water catchment solution. I would be really interested to know maybe in the chat session if some of you have loved having this, but generally, unless you can get them really high, the pressure coming out of them is not enough to really feed into an irrigation system. There are a couple ways you can get around that, but typically people are going with like a watering can or maybe a slow flow hose to empty them. We get rain so infrequently that if you're relying on it for water, you're probably going to be using a lot of city water too. And you pretty much always still have to design an overflow if you want to figure out where in your landscape the water's going. So rain barrels do have their value in our particular legal environment and the amount of water we're able to catch. I have personally not found them as helpful. But I'm happy to talk about them a little bit more if you want. And I did think this kind of schematic down here does a really good job of showing how you would put them in with the screen, with the overflow, with the spigot to get the water out on a level surface. That also, if you are putting in a bigger one, needs to be able to support a lot of weight. But to me, the most logical place to store the water is in the soil because there is no legal restriction on how much water you can put in the soil. And if you design your catchments well and you use your soil as a sponge, it can stay wet for weeks after a rainstorm and in a way that requires very little maintenance, and the water is immediately put to use by life. So I really am a fan of the kind of in-ground catchment systems. The first one I wanted to mention is the concept of a rain basin. And this actually is a picture of Brad Lancaster's curve cuts. And maybe just to tell this story briefly, Brad Lancaster is based in Tucson, Arizona. And he lived in this suburban area where he would notice in huge rain events that the amount of water that came down the street was just unbelievable. And he thought, I kind of want that. I want to put that water in my landscape instead of sending it down the storm drain. And so he made a cut in the curb, and the water started flowing right into his property, and he dug this big old catchment for it. And a few days later, or weeks, I can't remember the timeline, the city came by and gave him a big old fine because you're actually not allowed to do that. And he's like, okay, well, it was still worth it, And then a couple of years later, the city came back and said, wow, this is an amazing solution to prevent flooding and to make use of our water. Can you actually teach us how to do it? And so in Tucson, this is a practice that's more commonly done now, particularly dry environment. It's beginning to happen more in Denver as well. One of my co-teachers, Avery Ellis, is working on that a little bit. But the idea, whether you do it from a curve cut or a rooftop or another drainage, is basically you're just creating a big old basin in the ground that's going to hold your water. And we'll talk about how to size and kind of shape these all in a moment. But this is a particularly helpful solution if you have a flattish landscape, because you don't have to worry about actually using the contours or the slope very much. You're just directing the water to a spot. If you have, say, I've designed a couple of sites like this as well. I'm realizing I completely forgot to say what I actually do, which might be irrelevant, but I did run an ecological landscaping business for a while, and I teach with Boulder Permaculture, and I also run a permaculture-based homestead. So I'm going to pull examples from both my work and some of my colleagues here. But I've often come across the circumstance when working with clients where they have a postage stamp yard and a huge roof. And so pretty much the only earth form that can actually hold that volume of water is going to be one that is taking up the entire yard, right? So that's kind of a helpful pattern if you have that high volume in a small space. One thing to think about is just the access within this. If you plant the whole thing out, it can be a little challenging to get in there. And so for landscapes that are going to require a little bit more maintenance or regular flow, it just takes a little bit of thinking about how that's going to work. Some other catchment patterns make more easy kind of clear access pathways, but really helpful pattern in general. The other one that I want to mention is the contour swale, also sometimes called a bioswale. This is a bigger landscape picture of one, and I'll show you some more suburban examples in a moment, but this is actually Benevolence Orchard, if anywhere one has been there. And I just liked it because you can kind of see clearly what's going on. But basically you find the level line on the landscape. And in any landscape that has any kind of a grade, water is tending to move across it and pool. It runs off. In landscapes that aren't vegetated, it's often erosive. But regardless, there's some water movement going on. And so if you find the level line of the landscape and dig basically this basin and berm shape, what happens is as water moves down the hill, it's going to hit that level line and it's going to stop dead because there's no slope, and it's going to deeply infiltrate. And that is actually a really helpful tool, even if you weren't going to deliberately plant anything, just to rehydrate land and keep your water in it. But what it also does is creates this really moist basin, as well as a slightly drier berm. We'll talk about those microclimates in a moment. That allows you to have this kind of wet planting area and to easily hold the water in your landscape. So this pattern of contour swale is really helpful when you do have at least a little bit of grade on your property, challenging or not perhaps as effective to do when you're dead flat. Although I've played with that and it can be still somewhat helpful. It also is really helpful because it completely evenly distributes that water across the line, across the basin of the contour area. You get this even distribution that is helpful for planning planting and for just actually soaking into your landscape. If you do have a fair amount of runoff or slope and you're trying to establish a plant that maybe needs a little more water, concentrating the water in your landscape in that berm will kind of accelerate what you can actually grow in that spot. So that can be helpful. And then the other thing about this pattern is it does create really nice, easy, clear access pathways. Usually these aren't dead straight, and we'll talk about how to find them in a sec, but nevertheless, they tend to roughly parallel each other on a landscape, so you end up with a space that's walkable and manageable between them, even mowable if you choose to keep a little bit of grass in there. This top picture, by the way, is the swales planted out, so you can get a feel of how the landscape looked down the road. Cool place to visit if you haven't been. So how do you find a contour? There are a lot of fancy ways to do it, but I'm going to show you the simplest tool that you can definitely build yourself, which is called an A-frame level. This is a picture of my slightly irregular A-frame level that nevertheless is dead level in spite of the crooked support beams. But basically the idea here is if you take and assemble this kind of A-frame shape, if you start yourself off on a dead flat surface, you can use something like level. And that's what I did. I found somewhere that I knew was dead flat. And then I assembled this so that when the level sat in the middle of this, it was on level. So I knew, okay, if these two bottom parts of the A-frame are sitting on level ground, the level will be level. And I now know those 2 points are level to each other. This type of A-frame that's depicted in the sketch here, if you happen to find yourself in a place where you can't get a level, maybe you're in the woods, stranded, trying to harvest water, a really simple way to do that is to actually hang a rock on a string and mark the point on the post where that sits. You'll then be able to know when it's sitting dead straight down that you're at a level spot. And if you only have uneven terrain to find that with, you can also go ahead and turn, gosh, it's hard to demonstrate this on a virtual call, but you can basically do it one direction. So say you have your post here and your post here, you make your line, flip it the other way around. Maybe you were off kilter, so the line is the other way. And then the middle point between those two lines is your center point. I'm not sure if that made any sense. We live in an urban area. If you can find a level surface and stick a level on there, it's pretty easy. But I liked the sketch on the left because it gives you a great visual for how to actually find that level line. So you're basically just going to put this down, get it level, and then flip it around. So you'll move that bottom leg to the other side. Then you'll move it again. You'll keep marking that, and you've now marked your level line across the landscape. And if you wanted to go ahead and dig your contour swale, an easy pattern is to maybe flag this or sticks or stakes or whatever you want to use, make a paint line across that whole area, can be somewhat rough, and then hollow out the upper end and pile it below. So basically the contour basin sits on the top, the berm sits on the bottom. Really easy digging pattern, easy to do with a shovel and a little bit of help depending on how big your landscape is. What you'll also want to do once you've done that is check that the basin of the swale is also level. So that's what's going on in this picture. This is one of our farm partner properties, and we had already basically dug out the berm and basin forms, and we came with the A-frame and double checked that the bottom is also dead level. Because if the bottom is not level, you'll find that the water ends up running and pooling to whichever part of it is not level. So really easy tool on a landscape level, works great. Quick way to figure out what the contours are in your yard. And here's actually a great visual. This is my co-teacher, Avery Ellis, again, many years ago now in his backyard. This is kind of an image of what that swale looked like as he was digging it out in a more suburban setting. He was, of course, using a laser level, which you can surely also use if you have one, but you don't need one for sure. But the question that you're going to find yourself with is, okay, how much swale should I dig? How big should I actually create these earthworks to be? And this is the same kind of formula if you're going to go with a rain basin shape too. But basically you want your earthworks to be large enough to hold a 1-inch rainstorm. And so we did those calculations before. We're going to pretend here that we're getting these 29.2 cubic feet from a downspout, and we're trying to build a swale to hold the water from that downspout. We'll talk about depth in a sec, but in general, wide and shallow is better. So say on average, maybe the base is kind of 8 inches and the edges are a little shallower, but say on average, we're looking at about a 6-inch depth on that swale basin. We want it to be about 3 feet wide. that means we're going to need a total of 20 linear feet to get to 30 cubic feet here. I hope that calculation made sense. Happy to answer questions if it didn't later, but basically we're saying, okay, this is the size swale that will hold 30 cubic feet of water, which means in a 1-inch rainstorm, this will completely fill up. And that's helpful because that's about the amount of water that we think we'll get at one time in a rainstorm in a typical year. And so if you were, for example, designing a rain garden instead with the same pattern, you'd be doing the same thing, except it might not be linear, right? You might be kind of extrapolating and estimating the formula for the area of a circle and going with that instead. But ultimately, I find that it's more helpful to calculate the cubic feet of runoff than the gallons because it makes these earthworks calculations a lot easier. And so in general, whether you're building a rain basin or a swale, it's better to have a gentle, shallow, wide slope. And the reason for that is if water is moving in these areas and it's steep, you're going to get erosion. And so the more gentle this shape is, the more it will hold. When you are working with a very clay soil, it can hold its form a little bit better, and it's also prone to holding the water a little bit better. So if you're working in a clay soil, you probably want to make it a little bit deeper, and you can get away with it being steeper. If you have a really sandy soil, it's just going to infiltrate right away. So you don't need as deep of a catchment basin, but you probably need a more shallow shape to make sure that it doesn't erode. The other thing to think about is access, and we'll talk about the microclimates in a little bit, but you may, for example, in this picture decide, okay, maybe the lawn above the swale is where we're actually going to walk and we're going to plant in the basin here. Or maybe we're going to say the driest, most degraded, hard to establish vegetation part on this landscape is now the berm. So let's flatten that and use that as our walking path. We'll talk about that again in a moment, but it's definitely, as you're designing the shape of your earthworks, you do want to think about how are you going to get into them, right? Something else to think about is the shape of the berm. In general, if you're planning to use it as a walkway or devegetate it, kind of flattening it out, which has probably happened a little later in this case, but flattening it is more helpful for establishing vegetation and using it in any way. So it doesn't need to be quite as mounded as that, especially in this climate. Cool. And we'll pause before we get into plants and all that when we're done with the earthworks, just so you know. So save questions or feel free to type them as we go. The other thing to think about is, okay, we're saying obviously in most cases, we're getting a 1-inch rainstorm, but sometimes we're going to get a 3-inch rainstorm, and we need to know what the water is going to do when we get that. Because if you don't plan for what the water is going to do, the water is going to find the lowest spot on your earthwork, whatever it is, and it's going to breach it and it's going to go wherever it wants. And sometimes it's a little helpful to think through, okay, if this did overflow, where do we actually want it to overflow, and to deliberately design that. And so the other thing to think about too is you may be in a situation where you have 2 swales and you actually want one to overflow into the other one, and that represents the entirety of your catchment. And so this is just an example of a property that I worked on a year or so ago in suburbia, but basically the water comes out of the left here into this dry creek bed that's lined with weed barrier. The first thing that happens is there's a slight raise in elevation here so that it fills up this whole contour swale, the kind of bare dirt. I hope you can see my pointer. I'm not positive you can, but it's basically, it will fill first this contour swale. Once that contour swale is completely full, the level will rise enough that it will continue down the creek bed, and then it will begin to fill the next contour swale. And when the level of that fills, it'll continue on down. And so of course, in many rainstorms, only the top one will fill. In some rainstorms, the bottom one will also fill. And so that will help us plan which plants to put where, but it also gives the water a clear path. And we've kind of designed where we want it to go in the event of rain. So just an example of how earthworks can interact. In some cases, if your yard isn't big enough to even hold a 3-inch rainstorm, you might design an overflow that takes it straight back down into the street, or onto your driveway where it can get into the street, or whatever your context is. But the easiest way to design your overflow is to say, okay, let's actually just make an area that's slightly lower, line it with rocks so that it doesn't erode. And then that's the point the water is going to come out of and breach. And we'll talk about ways of moving water in a moment. Another really cool form, I actually have not had the joy of digging this myself yet, but I've seen these and they're used all around the world to catch water, is this boomerang swale pattern, where basically water is going to come and settle right in the crook of this earthwork. And as the water accumulates, it's going to come up and up and up and up. And when it finally has filled up, it's going to just gently overflow in a non-erosive way down. And then it can be directed directly into the next boomerang swale. So that's a really cool earthwork shape and is especially helpful in climates that have maybe even less rainfall than we have, because the water is being concentrated to that one spot where the tree is planted. And if you have a flood, it's not going to be erosive. It's going to slowly fill and then overflow. But a way of basically channeling water to specific points of the landscape and then designing them to overflow into each other. So just a cool form I wanted to show. So once you've decided how big your catchment is going to be and roughly where you want it, before you dig it, think about how you're actually going to get the water to it, which can be an easy or challenging question, depending on a few things. Whoops. Just to talk through a few strategies, I guess to contextualize this, the main thing you need to think about is that in order for water to actually keep moving, it needs about a 2% grade or steeper. If you think back to that A-frame level that we have, that I showed a little earlier, I've actually designed mine so that the base of it is 4 feet wide. And the reason that's helpful to me is because I know that if I can get a drop of 1 inch in a 4-foot area, we're at a 2% grade. And so when I'm trying to figure this out with just an A-frame level, a laser level is certainly a little bit easier, but if all you've got is an A-frame, there's basically a little stub that you can make a like 1 inch stand on one side of your A-frame, right? And you can use that to then basically show, okay, one side is now 1 inch higher than the other, and now it's reading level. That means I have a 2% drop. I have a 1 inch drop over 4 feet. Again, some of these things are a little easier to show in person than on a virtual call, but that's a way to figure it out on a suburban landscape that I've done before. So wherever you're putting your catchment, you need to make sure that there's always a 2% grade of at least to get your water to it. If you're dealing with a dead flat landscape and trying to move your water a long distance, that can really be challenging. And pretty much the options that you're left with are to actually elevate your gutter and have kind of a sloped gutter, which you could put along a fence line or a house or whatever, depending on where you are, so that the gutter itself is creating that grade, but you're starting at a higher point. Sometimes you can dig down if your landscape is, especially if you're not going very far, you can end up with a like slightly deeper depression and you can dig slowly down to it. Few strategies there that we can talk through maybe more in the questions. But the thing to note too is that if you get much steeper than a 3% grade, depending on your soil type, you start becoming erosive. So you don't really want water flowing over bare ground at more than a 3% grade, or it's going to start taking the sediment with it and slowly hollowing it out. So a couple of different strategies here for getting water to your catchment. The first is this very simple gutter extender. Really nice when your landscape is steep. That's one reason to use it, because of course, within this, you're not going to end up having erosion. Other nice thing about it is that if you're not trying to irrigate the landscape it's passing through, there's no leakage. You're not losing any of your water en route. So if you were trying to channel it across like a patio area or around a patio area, this is a very flexible, easy to get gutter extender form that will take your water where you're trying to put it. And you can do that at a very steep grade and it'll be just fine. If it is coming out of this thing at a really steep grade, you may want to consider reinforcing where it comes out with some rock or something non-erosive, but that's a helpful tool. Another option that can be quite aesthetically pleasing too is the dry creek bed look. So you can see on this landscape, we actually do kind of want some of the water to infiltrate here because there's a tree and there's vegetation over here. So water is infiltrating into this dry creek bed, but we're not putting vegetation in it. So we've used landscape barrier weed cloth, which is actually something I really, really hate in most all circumstances. And this is about the only one that I use it in. But we have coming from the gutter at about a 2% grade, we have this dry creek bed. And you can actually get away with a steeper grade with these too because it's lined and there's no opportunity for it to really catch bare soil. So if you need to do it at a steeper grade, you can use this pattern to do it. It looks really nice. You get some water infiltration as you go, but your main function with this is to try and move the water down or out. The final example I wanted to give here, and this was an install we did last year for someone who really wanted the kind of rock deserty vibe. But basically in this setting, this entire rain kind of catchment area is an off-contour swale. So this entire thing is progressing at a 2% grade down to the bottom. And the reason we did that is that we know that at a 2% grade, that water is still going to infiltrate, but we wanted to make sure that it came evenly through the landscape and didn't pool too much at the top. And so that's why we chose to use the off-contour swale in this case, but that basically keeps the water moving through the whole landscape evenly. And then there's kind of a pool you can't see here. That's the final catchment basin down by the road. And that is not lined with weed barrier. This is intended as a planting area. As you can see, it's a very dry landscape. So this is the wettest part of the landscape is where we have planted everything right into that contour swale. Other note, test your earthworks before you fill and plant them, because once you fill them with mulch and put plants in them, one, they'll be very hard to adjust, and two, you'll be actually struggling to see what's really going on. And so it feels like an exorbitant use of water. If you are willing to be patient and actually just wait for a big rainstorm and you're digging these in spring, that is the best. You watch the water come right out of your gutter and you see what it does. It breaches somewhere you didn't expect. You patch that up. You make sure that the volume is actually what you expected. If you don't have the patience or are maybe digging this in a really dry season, the one-time investment in running your hose at the top of it like it was a rainstorm is so helpful for seeing what actually happens and making adjustments while you can. So highly recommend doing that. Cool. So I think that covers the basics of actually shaping the earthworks, and we'll go ahead and pause here for questions before moving on to how you fill and plant them. Let me get out of presentation mode here so I can see the chat as well.
Yeah, let me take a look. Sharon, thank you for sharing that 5-hour permaculture class for free. There's a link in the, I also moved it into the chat too, just in case people didn't see it in the Q&A, but there's a free resource there with Oregon State. Okay. Someone's asking just like the logic behind the 100 gallons law. Do you know about that?
Yeah, so basically the reason that that exists is because every drop of water that falls in our watersheds in Colorado is owned by someone downstream. And so the theory is if enough people were to actually harvest water from their rooftops, it would decrease the amount of water that infiltrated downstream and made its way into the water and riverways that people downstream are relying on for irrigation. It's kind of interesting because it used to be illegal to catch any rainwater off your roof, actually. And my co-teacher, Avery Ellis, really worked pretty hard on trying to shift that patterning. And they managed to prove that if everybody caught 100 gallons from their roof, it would have a negligible to no impact on the downstream water supply. And as I understand it, when you store water, especially in a landscape, it kind of just delays its return to the river, but it still gets there. So I'm curious how that maybe evolves in the future, but that is the reasoning for it.
Sorry, I have a, I don't know if you can hear the phone in the background. I'm just gonna mute for a second.
Oh yeah, no problem. I also, is there somewhere I can see questions other than the chat? I should have found this. Is there like a separate questions?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
just
there it is. Okay,
yeah,
yeah,
the Q&A.
Thanks. I should have found that
No
before.
worries. Someone was asking about the infrequent rainstorms in Colorado. I'm assuming that the rain basins, they dry out in between storms. Do you have any sense of like how long they stay full? Does it really just depend kind of on the season we're having?
Yeah, so I think this is going to tie into the second half of the
Okay.
presentation a lot too, which is how do you actually turn your like soil into a sponge and pick the right plants?
Okay.
Because yeah, maybe I'll circle back as we go into
That's
that part.
perfect.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, when doing the earthwork, do you measure the heights after you tamp down? If building a berm, should you plant something like grass on it right away so it doesn't wash away?
Yeah, so I think your options with the berm, we'll talk about kind of the vegetation of them a little later. They become the driest part of the landscape. It
Mhm.
is really important to either tamp them down and use them as a path, and they become tamped enough you can use them that way, or revegetate them. But they're going to be a very different plant community than what goes in the basin, because that is now the driest, most exposed, disturbed part of the site. So yes, amazing to revegetate them, but it's going to be a different plant cohort.
For sure. Uh,
Um, Let me look here too. Can you get a permit for larger water barrels? Maybe you know this, Phoebe. I believe that you can only get a permit if you are like if you have well water or you're not like you don't have access
oh,
to city water. I think there are except like permits that you can get specifically to catch water in that context, but I don't think you can get them otherwise. I don't know if
yeah,
you know more than that.
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I don't. Maybe the city website has one, but I don't have that information.
And so I'm coming to some of these later questions here. One is a question about having a lot of bindweed where you want to make a rain garden. How do you prevent it taking over? Um, you can't. I think the bindweed in a way, like you can obviously dig the earthwork form, but that root system is so deep that like I personally have actually really loved interacting with bindweed by seeing it as a useful soil building crop. And I've noticed that the more developed and fungal my soil becomes, and the more vegetated it becomes, the more the bindweed goes away, and that it actually has like kind of filled a useful niche when I have very disturbed young soil, and kind of in my forest garden literally has gone away without me doing anything except kind of embracing its soil shading thing. I think that's a more complex question. If your goal is to get rid of the bindweed, there's not a whole lot of easy ways I know of to do that other than just letting your soil mature. And your plants shaded out to a point where it kind of shifts in ecological succession away from weed and towards forest. I think that has a much more nuanced answer that we maybe don't have time to get into as
Yeah,
well, though.
for sure.
I'm also seeing the dry creek beds and a different solution than plastic weed barrier. Um, the real challenge is that basically that is becoming a very moist environment where plants really want to grow. And once the plants grow in it, it ceases to actually transport water particularly well. And so I have not personally found a solution other than that, even though I genuinely hate plastic weed barrier and don't use it in any other context. If anyone else wants to throw in solutions they've used, that's great. But it's the solution that I've found makes it possible to maintain a dry creek bed as like a place for water to pass through as opposed to like a place to grow vegetation. But like I showed in that one example, in a way, if you can use the whole catchment area to grow vegetation, that's a better pattern too. So then you would obviously not need it. um let's see, I'm trying to see which of these might there's a lot popping up suddenly
Yeah. I feel like some of them you'll get into
in the later part.
the later part.
um if you just have gutters running out into planted areas of your yard, isn't that roughly the same? Definitely. I think what we're really looking at with these is like, how do you maximize the shape to actually hold the water? Vegetation holds water really well, too. And sometimes once the vegetation's established enough, it is its own contour and the whole root system acts as a sponge. This is really helpful though when you're establishing a new landscape, especially, and also to actually just make sure that you're maximizing the water that stays as opposed to letting it run off, because that contour earthwork shape is very effective for that. Yep. You need water to be captured at a certain distance away from the house. Yes, definitely don't dig your rain basin right by your foundation. It's helpful to pull all of this a little bit away from the house for foundation reasons. Great. Looks like someone else is suggesting 4-inch deep chip gravel as a weed barrier solution instead of weed barrier, which is great. I haven't personally tried it, so I can't speak to that, but would love if you all tried it and did. Great. I think I'm going to keep rolling if that's okay, because a lot of this is going to be answered in the second half, and then we'll circle back to what didn't get answered.
That sounds
after
perfect.
that. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Amy.
Great. Let me get back to... I'm still screen sharing, right? Yeah, I just have to get back to presentation. Okay, cool. So the first step, of course, is designing the catchment to hold the water, but that water, as many of you are pointing out, isn't going to stick around that long unless you actually have soil that is spongy enough to hold it. And so the best way to do that is with straight up organic matter. Just to speak to a couple of different strategies here, and I think this like soil science piece could be its whole own session, but typically the two things that I would use are compost and or mulch, depending on the setting. The benefit of mulch, in addition to sponging up water, is that it's actually going to shade the soil. And if you have 4 inches of that mulch sitting there, the coolness of the soil is going to retain that water so much better. And speaking again, just to bindweed, I have kind of a sort of more fond relationship with bindweed than many people. But when I go into my forest garden, which is a very low water system at my homestead, and I stick my hand under that bindweed on a hot day, the temperature is like 20 degrees cooler than the place that didn't have the bindweed. And so the value of just creating shade on a landscape is tremendous for holding water in it. Deep mulch is a great way to do that. Vegetation is obviously the best way to do it, but it takes a little while for that to sometimes get going. So in this kind of system, 2 to 4 inches of mulch is amazing. You can get woody mulch for free, which makes it a really accessible tool. If you're willing to also jumpstart the system with a little compost, even better. But both of those are basically just adding organic matter to the soil. And that is what's really going to sponge up all the water that goes into your earthwork and make it last way longer than it would with just the catchment itself. The other cool thing about mulch is when you think about it, there's a lot of quick solutions for aerating soil, some like tilling that actually kind of have the opposite effect in the long run. But the small, slow solution way to aerate soil that is very long lasting is when you have that organic matter on the surface of your soil, earthworms are going to tunnel up through the soil to get to it. And then they're going to tunnel back down, and they're going to leave you a whole bunch of little holes in the process of doing that, that help that water that's catching in this basin infiltrate way more deeply as well. And so this is obviously on a much bigger landscape, but just to demonstrate the power of this, this is a property that is both a partner site for my Niwot Homestead project and drylands agroecology research. But the practice that I'm going to call it DAR for ease has been practicing on all sorts of properties around the county is basically digging this contour swale water catchment. Water from the landscape seeps down into that basin. This mulch acts as a battery and soaks it up, especially all that winter snow melt that just sits there and gets really soaked into it. And then trees and shrubs are planted with zero irrigation into that type of system. And they're seeing about an 80% survival rate of trees and shrubs in that setting. And I think that's a really powerful example of how much intentional design can enable us to establish plants that aren't supposed to be able to live here without irrigation, because literally 2 months after the last spring rains, you can stick your hand or a soil probe into this type of system and it's still wet. And obviously this is on a large landscape, but it's the same effect in a backyard. you can hold water for weeks and months later than you would if you didn't have this type of catchment and the sponge to soak it up. Another really cool example of building soil. This is over another DAR site, Elk Run Farm. This is actually on a more suburban scale though, where they basically used pigs and chickens and crops and mulch to build their soil from parking lot into this beautiful rich dark soil you see here that has an organic matter percentage of about 18% currently. If you ask someone what a healthy organic matter percentage is for agricultural soils, they'll tell you about 5. When you have an 18% soil organic matter, your ability to sponge up water is unbelievable. And in that area, they grow crops that can be irrigated only into about early June. Then their well doesn't have enough water to do it. Those crops finish and produce really well by fall because their soil is built up so much that it acts as a sponge. So again, we could spend a whole lot more time on the soil science, but covering and filling that basin with organic materials is key to holding it in the landscape. And in a way, this form just creates a spot to pile up a whole bunch of wood chip if it does nothing else. Just a couple of notes on the mulches that you might choose. When you go to a landscape supply store, the main mulch that you're going to find is cedar-based mulch. That is about the worst mulch you could use in this type of system. The reason that people like it is the same reason they like building with cedar. Cedar is pretty antimicrobial and it resists breaking down. So the mulch sticks around for a long time, and surely that shades the soil. That is one really good thing that it does. It keeps it covered. However, if your goal is actually to feed the soil life so that they can infiltrate and add air and goodies to your soil, and if your goal is to actually feed your plants with broken down woody material and turn that into organic matter that stays in the soil, cedar is a really bad wood to do that because it just doesn't break down very fast. So if we actually think back to that ecological succession framework, the best type of mulch to use is the one that matches where your plants come from. If you are trying to mulch and plant plants that belong in a grassland, you probably want to use straw mulch. If you are trying to plant coniferous plants, you probably want to use pine mulch or conifer mulch. But in this particular rain garden setting, usually you're going to want to use a deciduous tree mulch if you can find it. The cheap and easy way to get this is through ChipDrop. ChipDrop is an app that connects you with arborists who need somewhere to dump their chips, so they'll show up for free. You get on a list. In spring, it can take a couple weeks for them to show up. In winter, it's pretty quick in my experience. The downside of this is you do have to commit to getting about 20 cubic yards of mulch, which is a lot more than many folks want. So if you can go in it with your neighbors, that's amazing. There are also, of course, the mulch piles that the Boulder County has that you can drive up. Never know exactly what you're getting, but you can get those there. Shredded leaves are a great option for this. If you do actually want to go and buy a mulch because that's predictable, or you can get someone to deliver just the amount that you want, the best commercial one that I've found is what Lee Hill Pete is calling humus, but it's basically a very, very finely ground pine-based mulch. I would rather have deciduous than pine in a lot of cases, but pine is better than cedar. And it's broken down so small that it still does actually decompose quick. And it is the spongiest stuff. It'll hold a whole lot of water. So that would be my recommendation if you wanted to go and buy it. One thing just to note as you're designing and planting this type of basin is you really, really don't want to end up with unbroken down wood mulch in your soil. When you do that, this is maybe a little nerdier than we want to get right now, but microbes, bacteria in particular, like to digest carbon and nitrogen in this particular ratio. So when you build a compost pile, you're mixing the right ratio of carbon, brown materials, with the right ratio of green, nitrogen heavy materials. These wood chips are very carbon heavy. If you stick them raw in the soil, the microbes will be like, oh boy, I have a lot of carbon, but I don't have any nitrogen. So what they're going to go do is steal all the nitrogen that they can from the soil to balance it so they can eat. And you end up with highly nitrogen deficient soil. I've accidentally done this a couple of times. That's why I mention it. So just think a little bit about the order of how you're doing things. If you're building this rain basin in fall and you're going to let it sit and catch water all winter, maybe go ahead and mulch it. And then in spring, be very intentional about raking that mulch away, or make sure that it's fully decomposed. If you're going to spring plant, I would highly recommend digging it, planting it, and then mulching it so that you don't end up with that wood chip mulch in basin itself. So we now get finally to the actual piece on how we choose plants for rain gardens. And this is kind of a really interesting subset of plants because, as some of you have pointed out, even if these are really well designed and they sponge up water, they are going to get dry. In our late summer, these are probably going to be dry basins. At other times of year, though, they're going to be full of water and flooding. So the type of plant that we actually need is a plant that can handle both flooding and drought. And that is a rare collection of plants. Some of the best plants for that are actually the plants that live in our native plains riparian ecosystems. And the reason for that is because these plants, historically, a lot of these river areas and seasonal flows would dry up. So they'd get inundated in spring with all this snow melt. There weren't ditches to kind of slow the flow of water through the season. Pour out in spring, dry up in late summer. So many of these plants can handle both of those conditions. And I'll give some examples of plants in a moment, but just wanted on a pattern level to recognize that. Plants really not appropriate for rain gardens are things like Mediterranean herbs that don't like wet feet, conifers, shortgrass prairie natives. Those are amazing natives to plant in many garden contexts. However, in a rain basin is not a circumstance that they're evolved to. And wetland plants don't get enough water. So just to give an example of some of the plants that do belong in this kind of setting, if you're looking for a wonderful, eventually enormous shade tree, the hackberry is my favorite. Also has a little edible fruit that the wildlife love. If you suck it, it tastes like the best candy ever, even though the film of actual fruit is about a millimeter deep, but a really nice shade tree, pretty quick growing. Some of our native fruiting shrubs, the serviceberry is one of them, can be understory, can do a little bit of shade, or it can be the climax plant. The fruit is delicious. The birds usually get it first. Our native golden currant is another excellent one. Very fragrant, beautiful yellow flowers in spring, followed by fruit. False indigo, you'll see around a lot of our riparian areas now. Nice nitrogen fixing plant to tuck in. Wild plum, also one of the natives you see around here a lot, and then chokecherry. So those are examples of some trees and shrubs that do really well in this type of setting. I'm going to go through these kind of fast just because we're getting low on time, but we're happy to answer questions later too. If you have a sunny area that you're planting out, these are a few of my favorite perennials that do really well. Our quintessential milkweed for the monarchs. There's a few species of milkweed. This Asclepias speciosa seems to be the one in my experience that does best with both the dry and the wet. Maximilian sunflower is a perennial type of sunflower that I've put in a couple of these types of gardens and really thrives. It gets enormous, so keep that in mind. Sometimes can flop a little bit too. Anise hyssop is a great one. Echinacea, Canada goldenrod, and then I threw a grass in here. This big blue stem is actually a tall grass prairie grass species that can nevertheless be quite drought tolerant. So it does well in this setting, more than some of our prairie grasses that are a little more dry loving. For those of us who have gardens in shade, which is actually a lot of us trying to catch water, the options are a little more limited. But three that I particularly like, this bishop's weed you see all over the place, and I've heard people accuse it of being a little invasive. In my experience, it doesn't really invade unless there's moisture. So if you're trying to fill a basin and you're surrounded by dry, that's a great one. Sweet woodruff. And then our native clematis is actually both quite drought tolerant and water tolerant, and it has a lovely kind of puffy seed head and is a vining plant. If you are really in deep shade and you can't even get away with any of these plants, mushrooms are a great option. The wine cap mushrooms in particular are one of my favorites that you can layer into a woody mulch and it'll do quite well. So a couple final notes here just about where to plant. Obviously, in a rain basin, you have a slightly different shape, but the same idea that right in the basin where that mulch is thickest, where the water is pooling, is going to be where you're wettest. And that's where some of these true riparian species want to be. The top of the berm is the hot and dry spot. And so that could be a really cool place to stick in some of your prairie natives. Especially if you've just piled sod to make this. Decomposing sod seems to me to be the absolute favorite medium for growing prairie plants. It's like the decomposing grassy material is just what they want. So this could be a really great place for prairie plants. If you're early enough in spring or willing to irrigate a little bit, you can also seed this with grasses and that type of thing just to get that going. A really nice niche too is kind of just up onto the edge of this berm. You get a spot where the roots can reach down into that moisture, but they're also not going to get waterlogged. So if you have maybe a plant, even like an apple tree that really doesn't want wet feet, but still wants moisture, right up on kind of the edge of that berm is a cool place to plant it. And so you end up with this whole collection of different planting zones for different plants. And the ones that I've really just focused on as examples are the ones that belong right in that basin, whether it's a rain garden or a single swale. As we discussed earlier, it can be really nice to go ahead and use the berm as a walkway too, because it is the driest and hardest to regenerate part of the landscape. I just wanted to flash up this same picture as before again, just to point out that in this particular landscape on the left, it's a very dry landscape and we really wanted to plant where the water was. So we put all of our plants basically right on the edges of that basin so that they weren't going to be in the kind of main thoroughfare of the water where it gets super wet, but they were going to get the water. And the only ones on the berm are extremely drought tolerant plants. Some of our native shrubs like 3-leaf sumac that are tough as nails, yucca, soapweed yucca, but most of the plants get tucked in the part that has the water in it. That's very different from wet climates where you often see people mostly planting the berms and leaving these empty because they flood. So I just wanted to point out that pattern difference that in this climate, planting in the basin often makes a lot of sense. And using berms as pathways, not very ergonomic, but makes a better use of water. You'll see a whole lot of kind of permaculture examples flipped in wet climates with the planting area on the berm. So just wanted to note that. And I actually think for the sake of time, I was going to get a little bit into how to assemble these plants together, but we have only about 15 minutes and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to skip this last bit unless we happen to have no questions, and then I'll come back to it. And actually, sorry, let me just share one more thing really quick. I forgot that I meant to do this. But if anyone is actually interested in learning more about permaculture and taking a much deeper dive into all of this, there is a permaculture design course that myself and a few other teachers lead that's 1 weekend a month, April through October. And for attending this class, we did want to offer you a $100 discount on that course. So I believe this slide will be shared and you can get that with this discount code, but just wanted to share that if you are really excited to learn more about this and take a much deeper dive into the ecological design, soil science, the food production, the plant polycultures, all that good stuff, this is a great way to do it. And there's also pretty robust scholarships and such available for that as well. So just wanted to mention that, and let me go ahead and now come out so we can get back to questions. And if we don't have a lot, I'll go back to the other slides.
Sure. There's one question about mulch and whether there's fear around disease from the arborists, like cutting down trees. Do you know anything about that?
Like if there's a disease that's carried in the wood of the trees. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I would think about is one, like most cases when you're planting this type of rain garden, you're not planting a whole lot of tree species. So even if there were a specific disease that a tree happened to have, it would be unlikely to affect these plants. Some things I do think about a lot more are, for example, a lot of people treat ash trees with the neonicotinoid-based pesticides, which are systemic. So if you're getting ash tree chip specifically, it's quite likely that it actually comes with that in it, which is a little bit horrifying to me. What you can do on chip drop, though, is actually specify which species you're looking for. And if you specify something like, I want cottonwood chips, your odds of getting anything that would affect what you're trying to grow are very low. So you can be a little bit selective in that way. I personally have never had a problem, and I've used chips in so many contexts. I've never seen them spread anything. But I suppose there is a risk for very specific species and diseases of that happening.
Yeah.
Just try and get back to this so I can see the questions too.
Someone had a question. It's chipdrop.com, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing someone say, what's the preferred contour placement around mature trees? I think that's one of the trickiest things that I've encountered is when you have these landscapes that are already full of tree roots. What I've actually found works a little bit better in the couple times I've played with it is if you're removing the sod in particular, you can actually build up instead of digging down. That especially works when you're removing sod because you can actually use the sod kind of like bricks to catch the water and build your earthwork up around the base of a tree. I have also on occasion with the big tree gone ahead and dug regardless of the roots my basin, but it's tricky because more often than not there's some enormous root coming through that kind of breaks your earthworks up a little bit, and also you don't want to stress your tree out by doing so much digging. So much of this is kind of like you wish you designed it this way in the beginning, really helpful for new landscapes, but you can build up too.
For sure. We already answered something. Sorry, I'm trying to clear out some of the ones we've already answered.
Yeah, there's a lot coming in. I'm trying to scroll through them.
Smith.
How do you distribute the water to plants with different quantity needs? That is really like where you put them in the basin to me. If you have a xeric plant, it goes on the berm. If you have a tree that can handle the flooding, it can go right in the base and enjoy the water. So that's where you kind of get the like, just by the design and shape of the earthwork, you get the different niches to put the different plants in. And the ones I really focused on were the ones in the basin. And I see a question, are they spreading the mulch out? Yes, sorry, that picture was in progress. We were, in fact, we did spread the mulch out right after I took that. Do we need to plan around our underground city water line? Yes, definitely. I should have mentioned this. Get your utilities marked, figure out what's under the ground before you start digging. That is very helpful when digging these earthworks. Trying to see what else might go to the most people. Yeah, I think we got a lot of the recent ones. Are you seeing some that I am not?
I think we're good. The 811 will tell you about how far away from utility lines you need to be when you call them. Yeah, I think we're good. I think some of these are specific to homeowners, and we've answered a bunch, and I dismissed some that were just comments. So I think we're good.
Okay.
How do you feel though? Do you want to go into a little bit of the gilding and the planting, or I know it's 7:47. We have about just over 10 minutes.
I saw a request from someone in the questions to keep going. So since we have the time, maybe I'll just touch on it lightly and then we'll just end with back to your slide. Does that work?
For sure, yeah.
Okay.
And I believe these slides are going to be shared, right? Is that
Yes.
true? Okay. So for those asking, I think I've answered a few people already, but yeah, more of this you can dig into the slides too. All right, I'm gonna turn myself off here.
Okay, cool. So the next thing to kind of think about when you're laying out your plants is how do these plants form a community? And there's so much complexity that, again, we could spend a whole another couple hours getting into this, but in a very basic way, the concept of a guild is how do you assemble plants so that they work in a non-competitive way, a collaborative way, they form their own mini ecosystem with all the different functions accounted for. And so just a couple of things to think about in that are kind of these above ground niches. Can you use a tree to create shade for a plant that wants shade? Do you maybe plant the bishop's weed on the north side of the tree, but plant something like the serviceberry on the south where it's going to get a little bit more sun? There's a whole lot of patterns of plants too that show up as a non-competitive thing. So for example, when you think about what's happening under the soil, the form of the roots, maybe you have a taproot that looks kind of like a carrot, and you have a fibrous root system that's in the middle of the soil, and then you have these rhizomes that are creeping on the top. You often see that plants will actually position themselves that way so that underground the roots are not competing with each other. They're in different zones. You also want to think about the diversity of bloom times. The simplest pattern that I've ever come across to look at all of this is plant families. There are so many characteristics that track by plant family, from root system to flower time to use to which pests like to eat them, that it can be really helpful to just say, okay, I'm going to pick plants that are different plant families and assume that they're going to cover that diversity. And so just to show a really brief example of a guild that is well suited to this kind of dry riparian setting. What you'll see here is that we have several different niches. We have a shrub, we have a ground cover, we have another shrub, probably we have a tree somewhere above us here, but these are filling different niches in the understory. In our root systems, we have fibrous, we have taproots, we have rhizomes. Sometimes you can throw bulb into the mix, but the idea is that these different root shapes together will not compete with each other. We love to see blooming throughout the entire season because that supports pollinators best. So kind of making sure we have that diversity. And finally, if you did nothing else, just looking at different plant families will kind of hit many of these characteristics, right? So again, there's a lot of detail to this, but just thinking about how we can actually not maybe plant all mint family plants together in one spot, but actually look at how we can stagger plant families when we're planting to create that beneficial relationship is something to think about. And this picture here is an example of the forest garden at Elk Run, which is set up this way, where they actually are irrigating annuals on the berms, and then in the basin of the swales, which is right here, they've planted all of these perennials. Really nice strategy. And you can see this is a currant. There's some valerian poking up in the background. There's a sunflower they probably didn't plant. I believe that's an apple tree right there. But looking at this kind of almost the ecology of a forest in a microcosm of plants that go together with specific functions. One other pattern level way to do this without having to know much about any of the plants is to say, okay, I'm going to go over to the river near my house and I'm going to see which plants are growing there. And then I'm going to extrapolate, okay, this community of plants shows up. What is the edible or maybe preferred equivalent that I can plant that's related? This particular setup is obviously geared towards edible plants, but if I see a chokecherry growing in my riparian area, I can maybe assume that relatives of that chokecherry will do well here. And that's totally true. Cherry trees do, at least tart cherry trees do very well in Colorado. If I see a golden currant going, I might know a cultivated currant is going to grow well. If I see a native sunflower, maybe I'm going to move that to a Jerusalem artichoke. So again, I think this gives us a tool to say, okay, if you want to grow a rain garden, go to the closest riparian area you have, see what's growing there, and ask what other plant is in that family that has a similar niche that I can maybe sub or find at the nursery that I might want. So just a strategy for how to assemble these companionships without knowing a lot about them, just copying nature's patterning. Yeah, I'm going to stop there, and we just have a couple minutes left now. So I think, Phoebe, if you want to take back over, that's great. Or I don't know if there's a couple more questions, but.
Yeah, I will go ahead and do my little sign off, but then if we have time, you're welcome to answer a question or two. There weren't really any new ones. Okay. Let me find my screen. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm so excited about all the earthworks. I just think it's like a way to up level water savings and water, like increasing a absorbent landscape in your yard. And so yeah, it's exciting to see examples of this. So thank you so much. As I mentioned before, there will be a follow-up resources email, so look for that in the next day or two. The slides will be in there, the recording of this presentation, for those of you who couldn't stay the whole time or want more in depth with the slides. Thank you for attending, and thank you, South Adams County Water and Sanitation District for making this seminar possible tonight. And for everyone, our seminars run through August, and you can register on our website. We have quite a few this year. I think our total is at 29 or 30. We have some Firewise landscaping ones. I know there are some Firewise questions in there, so be sure to check out there. We have 2 different Firewise ones, as well as like a plethora of other topics. So join us there. Fill out our survey. We love feedback. We also share it with the speakers as well. So thank you for feedback, and we are pretty much at time. So I'm gonna, unless you have any closing thoughts, Amy, I think we can close it down unless you saw any questions that were popping in here before we sign off at 8.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer these couple since we have a few minutes if you want to keep it running or not, whatever works.
Let's do it. Let's close it down at 8. And if you're happy to answer a couple, let's do it.
Okay, cool. So I'm actually just going all the way to the top here to some I missed earlier too, but how do you support the weight of rain barrels or other catchment near foundation? If you're using the 50-gallon rain barrels, you truly like some cinder blocks are great. If you happen to be in a circumstance that allows you to catch a large volume of water, like those IBC totes, actually like setting a like concrete foundation and getting them secured to that is really supportive. But for the 50-gallon ones, you don't need a whole lot, honestly. And then what happens if our downspouts empty into mushroom drains? I think what you're talking about is those little like graded ones that carry the water off your property. If it were me, I would probably just cut my downspout a little bit higher and seal that with one of those like black tubes if that's what you're actually talking about. But just catching it before it gets into that, because those do in fact, as I expect, they go off your property, if I'm understanding that right. A question is about how to get water to a rain garden when it's far away or uphill. Definitely a big challenge. I have that situation at our homestead that all of the places we can catch water are deeply shaded as well. And for me, it's been more of a like, what can I grow where I can get the water easily? Because if you're trying to move water uphill, there aren't a whole lot of options short of pumping it or diverting your gutter way higher up on your house and actually using the gutter's slope itself to get it where you want it. But that may be feasible or not depending on your garden setting. So I often ask more, how can I use the water where I can get it to? Because moving it uphill in this way is a little challenging without actively pumping it. There's a question about if you're wanting a tree below power lines. I think both the serviceberry and the currant that were described there are both pretty low growing trees. Depending on the selection of serviceberry, you get a height from about like 6 to maybe 15 feet. So you could choose something like Regent only gets 6 feet tall, but both of those are more shrub-like. That would be great. I have a question about squirrels eating milkweed. I have never had squirrels eat my milkweed, and I'm not positive how to get away from that. I know a neighbor of mine used to have a motion activated sprinkler that did a really good job of keeping squirrels away, but perhaps the squirrels, yeah, maybe it's helpful for the squirrels and they're helpful for predators and it's all part of the food chain. I'm not positive on a personal experience with that one. Clarification about controlling the spread of bishop's weed in the long term. I think, again, with choosing plants in all of these circumstances, if I were somewhere that was like wet and wild, I probably wouldn't plant bishop's weed. I have it growing at my homestead because I eat it. It's a really delicious cooking green that is one of the only plants that will grow in the deep dry shade of my forest garden. But when it's really dry, it doesn't spread. So I would say that's an amazing plant to plant when you have a very dry area surrounding your planting area. And probably not something that I would put in a very wet, wild area where it's going to be so happy it goes everywhere. Have fires, firescaping. Yep, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of perspectives on firescaping right now, and one of the ironies in a lot of it is much firescaping asks us to actually stop vegetating the areas around our house, and that totally makes sense from a fire perspective. The interesting thing about it is it kind of makes our whole landscape hotter and drier, which contributes to fires being there in the first place. So I don't have great answers to that. But if you have space in your property, we know that wet vegetation and wet landscapes deter fire. And so I think obviously the guidelines about not planting close to your house in fire prone areas exist for a reason. If you can create this really wet catchment of lush vegetation around your house, our understanding is that that is a fire break in itself too. It probably is more effective when more people do it, and it actually changes the whole like water pattern. So that's a really juicy topic I'd love to get into more in another context.
For sure.
Poison hemlock is a noxious alien invasive plant. Someone is saying, please don't list it in Nature's Guild. I see nature as all plants. And I think even if poison hemlock isn't showing up as a like native plant, it's still showing up. And I think that shows us something about the niche that is wanting to be filled. And so to me, that is kind of like, I'm seeing poison hemlock there. What does that tell me about the niche that is being filled by nature, which we all belong to in some way? But would be worth noting that that is in fact a very poisonous plant. And I think that is it on the questions.
That is, and we are right at 8.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you so
Fast
much.
flips.
Thank you everyone who attended. I can see folks signing off here. Thank you so much, Amy. It's always a joy. I love listening and learning alongside you. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.